Inside the marble lobby of a luxury hotel, a well-dressed black woman quietly waits for a friend, but her calm presence draws uneasy stares, whispered comments, and then two security guards demanding proof that she belongs. Minutes later, she's in handcuffs, humiliated in front of silent onlookers. What the hotel staff doesn't know is, they just picked the wrong person, and today she's about to dismantle the very system that tried to erase her. Before we dive in this story, let us know where you're watching from. We love to hear your thought. It was the kind of southern Saturday that made the air feel thick with magnolia and memory. Sunlight trickled through iron balconies, jazz hummed faintly from a distance, and everything moved a few seconds slower, as if the heat itself refused to rush. But inside the Langston Regent Hotel, the atmosphere shifted into something colder, curated, sterile. Polished marble floors, crisp uniforms, conversations clipped to whispers. The kind of place that didn't welcome you, it measured you. Every surface gleamed like it was afraid of fingerprints. Celia Grant stepped into the lobby like she belonged to no one but herself. Tall, elegant, and unmistakably black, she wore a deep chestnut coat that fell just below her knees, the collar slightly turned up, soft curls pulled into a low twist. Her steps were calm but certain. Her bag, canvas and worn, read in faded blue ink, "Truth doesn't beg permission." Her presence didn't ask for permission either. It simply existed with quiet defiance. In a space that expected apology, she brought none. She walked past concierge desks and bellboys without glancing sideways. No flash, no entourage, no designer purse. Just purpose. She spotted the lounge to her left, a plush, velvet-clad space framed in gilded molding and overpriced silence. She chose a seat near the window, the sunlight catching the bronze in her skin. A menu rested on the table. She opened it slowly, scanning words like saffron-scented Earl Grey and smoked salmon rose toast without flinching. She wasn't here for the tea. She was early. Her friend, Dr. Evelyn Shapiro, a history professor from Tulane, was due at 3:30. So Celia waited. She crossed one leg over the other and folded her hands in her lap. Composed, unbothered. At least that's what she'd projected. That's what years of training had taught her to project. Across the room, someone noticed. A receptionist narrowed her eyes, her smile twitching with discomfort. She leaned toward a colleague and murmured. 2 seats away, a woman in a pearl button blouse lowered her voice to her teenage daughter. "She doesn't look like she's here for tea." The daughter, blonde and flush with new cruelty, slid her phone from her jacket and angled the camera subtly. The lens didn't blink, but Celia did not react. She felt it, the stare, the unspoken inventory of her presence, the measured discomfort reserved for those who didn't match the drapes. Her spine straightened. She didn't blink, but inside something shifted. A quiet, familiar burn behind her ribs, a warning flare. A memory lived too many times. Then the music paused, not literally, but in the air something changed. "Security to lounge," a voice echoed through the speakers, pleasant and practiced. "Guest assistance required." And just like that, she was no longer early. She was a threat. 2 security officers emerged from opposite ends of the lobby. One older, paunchy, his face fixed in bureaucratic suspicion. The other younger, lean and jumpy, hand already resting near his belt, not aggressive yet, but rehearsing for it. They approached her table like she'd left a backpack unattended at the airport. "Ma'am," the older one began, voice dry like a reprimand in church. "We've had a report of unusual behavior. Are you a registered guest?" Celia closed the menu slowly, precisely. Her voice was smooth, low, unimpressed. "I'm waiting for a colleague." She reserved a table under Dr. Shapiro. The younger officer's gaze flicked to his partner, then back to her. "Can we see some ID?" Without a word, she reached into her coat pocket and handed them her federal identification. Her name, her title, her credentials, all there. But the older man didn't even read past the photo. He glanced at it like it was a candy wrapper, then returned it with a shrug. "This doesn't prove you're a guest," he said flatly, "or that you belong in this part of the hotel." Celia tilted her head, her tone sharpened. "Is there a sign posted that says black women can't wait for friends in your lounge?" Before anyone could respond, the hotel manager appeared, slim in a navy suit, eyes flickering like candlelight in a breeze. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't sit. He didn't look her in the eye. "I'm sure this is a misunderstanding," he said, with the kind of smile that didn't touch his cheeks. "But a few of our patrons have expressed discomfort. You understand how that looks, I'm sure." Celia's voice dropped, quiet but lethal. "You mean how I look?" The manager's lips parted, but before he could stammer out a defense, the older officer stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to come with us." "No," she said, firm, sharp. "Not unless you can tell me what crime I've committed." It didn't matter. The handcuffs snapped over her wrists with the sound of finality. The metal was cold, tight, deliberate. Gasps echoed. Phones rose like courtroom gavels. Some recorded, some just watched, but no one stood up. Not even the ones who knew better. Not even the ones who felt shame. And then, like a pin dropped into glass, came a child's voice. "Daddy, why are they arresting her?" The father, suited and red-faced, pulled the little girl close. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Some people just don't follow the rules." As Celia was escorted past reception, the clack of her heels against marble echoed like accusations. Her jaw stayed clenched, her eyes fixed forward. But her chest was tight with something old and bitter. Because in that moment, she wasn't a former prosecutor, not a federal watchdog, not even a woman with power. She was black, she was alone, and she made someone uncomfortable. And here, in Baton Rouge's most prestigious hotel, that was all it took. The cuffs didn't come off. Not when the elevator doors slid shut behind her. Not when the marble gave way to old linoleum and the chandelier light turned to buzzing fluorescence that flickered like they knew a secret. Celia Grant was led, wrists bound, through a staff corridor that smelled faintly of bleach, stale coffee, and something darker, something bureaucratic and buried. The kind of smell that lingered long after the truth had been mopped away. And the air was still, heavy with routine silence. Every step she took echoed with quiet accusation. They turned left past a locked supply room, then right into a narrow hallway marked Operations. At the end stood a gray metal door, scratched around the handle from too many hurried hands. A black sign above it read, "Internal Security, Authorized Only." No one paused. No one checked. They didn't ask for authorization. They didn't think she was someone who deserved it. Inside, the walls were beige in the way that made you forget color existed. A cheap desk sat in the middle, cluttered with folders and 2 computer monitors, one blinking a blue error box that no one seemed eager to fix. The room wasn't meant for guests. It was meant for erasure, for silence, for shadows, for burying moments before they made it into memory. "Shit," said the older guard, not unkindly, but not like she had a choice. Celia sat. Her hands were still cuffed. No one had read her rights. No one had asked her name again, because in rooms like this, names weren't necessary. Roles were, and hers had already been assigned. Tanner Weiss entered a few moments later, a man whose hairline had started to retreat, but whose authority hadn't. He wore a Langston Regent lapel pin and a badge that didn't match any official government format. His first look at her wasn't one of recognition, it was dismissal. He carried boredom like a weapon, and in this room, that made him dangerous. He sat behind the desk, sighed like he'd had a long day, then picked up a pen. "Name?" Celia said nothing. He didn't care. "Unregistered walk-in, no confirmed guest status," he muttered, writing as he spoke. Observed loitering in tea lounge, declined to vacate when approached, escalated verbally, made staff uncomfortable. She looked at him then, slowly. "Is that the official language now? Uncomfortable?" Weiss didn't respond. He clicked his mouse, opened a security folder marked Lobby March 9, and began dragging footage into the recycle bin. Across the room, another figure sat hunched over a second terminal, Gina Flores, 20-something, efficient, robotic. Her headset rested around her neck, her fingers fast and familiar with deletion. On Gina's screen, footage of Celia sitting in the lounge flickered, then vanished. File after file, no passwords, no approvals, just click, drag, delete. Celia watched the screen, eyes unblinking. She wasn't surprised. She was memorizing every movement, every file name. The timestamp in the corner, 3:24 and 11 seconds p.m. The folder, tcam_Southview. The file, susk_guest_14 move. She didn't need a warrant. She had memory and precision and reason. Her silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. Behind her, a phone rang. Weiss answered lazily. Yeah, we've got her. Easton said to file it under discretionary threat protocol. Report goes up tomorrow morning. Should be clean by then. Celia's chest tightened at the name. Judge Leonard Easton. She knew that voice, that history. A man who once blocked 3 civil lawsuits citing insufficient municipal liability. A man she had grilled under oath 2 years ago in front of Congress. And now, here he was. Still in power, still turning gears behind polished doors, still protecting the machine, and now she was caught inside it. Again. Weiss hung up. Looked at her for the first time with mild curiosity. You know, he said, leaning back in his chair, we don't usually get this kind of trouble on a Saturday. You people usually know better. Celia's jaw didn't move, but her eyes lit with something cold and calculating. He didn't notice, or maybe he thought she didn't matter. The fluorescent lights hummed louder. Gina reached for her coffee, sipping slowly as she deleted the final log. Celia tilted slightly in her chair, enough to glimpse the open phone line on the desk beside her. Beige, dusty, but active, unlocked, waiting. That hum was no longer background, it was opportunity. And suddenly, everything she'd studied came back at once. Every hearing, every wrongful detention case, every emergency protocol she'd ever drafted. She knew the system, and she knew its weaknesses. She turned back to Weiss, who was now filing a use-of-force justification, complete with fabricated witness concern and verbal resistance. She didn't flinch. Not yet. Because this wasn't the moment to argue. This was the moment to remember, to study, to survive. Just 3 feet to her right, the unguarded phone line sat humming like a signal waiting to be sent. The next move would come fast. But first, she had to make it out of this room without blinking. This room. A coffin built of complacency and collusion. A place designed to erase women like her. But Celia Grant wasn't here to disappear. She was here to make it count, and what came next had to be precise. The hum of the ceiling light was louder now, a flickering buzz that made the silence in the room feel almost electric. Celia sat still in the chair, her wrists still cinched tightly in cold steel. The sting had become a dull ache. She didn't wince. Pain was irrelevant. She wasn't thinking about her wrists anymore. She was thinking about timing. Across the room, Gina Flores stood up to stretch. She yawned without covering her mouth, fingers curling above her head like she had nothing to fear. She glanced at her phone, mumbled something about needing another coffee, and walked out through the side door. The hallway beyond it swallowed her quickly. Her absence left the room off balance. And Celia, waiting, felt the shift. Tanner Weiss was still at his desk, turned away, speaking into his headset, his voice low and distracted. Just need the final version by midnight. No pushback from Easton. He signed off already. He chuckled, a dry, knowing sound. She's nobody. That was his mistake, the kind men like him always made, mistaking quiet for weakness. Celia's gaze shifted. 3 feet to her right, the old beige phone sat on a desk, forgotten, its receiver resting neatly in place, the line still blinking green. Active, open, exposed, no code, no lock screen, just a dial tone waiting for purpose. And Celia had written the purpose. She didn't need permission. Just access. Years ago, she helped draft the federal emergency protocols for government officials unlawfully detained on U.S. soil, an obscure, little-known network built in the wake of classified failures. She had insisted on one detail. It had to work from landlines, not just secure cell devices, landlines. Because power doesn't always vanish with gunfire. It fades in whispers, in shadows, in back rooms like this. Her fingers moved fast, precise, the cuffs making it harder but not impossible. She bent forward, keeping her back straight to avoid drawing attention, the phone wedged awkwardly between her shoulder and cheek as she pressed the numbers one by one. Star 9916. The code bypassed dispatch and routed the call through encrypted relays. It didn't ping local networks. It went straight to D.C. The phone rang once, then twice. "Federal emergency line," said a voice on the other end, calm, clipped, controlled. Celia didn't pause. "Code 419, field grade breach. Langston Regent Hotel. I am unlawfully detained. ID, Grant, Celia Miriam. Authorization level Bravo Sierra 3. Connect me to Ethan." Her voice never shook. She was past fear. There was a silence, just long enough to know the voice on the other side was verifying everything. Then a low shift, the sound of a line transfer, and then, "Celia?" His voice didn't sound like family. It sounded like a blade. "Ethan," she breathed. "They don't know who I am. No Miranda, no camera. All footage from the lounge has already been scrubbed. I saw the logs disappear, and Easton's name is on the report." There was no gasp, no outrage, just steel. "I want everything," Easton Grant said. "Pull the civil archive, every complaint tied to Langston's internal security since 2015. Get me cross-section logs from Judge Easton's bench, and deploy TAC Unit 7 to Savannah. Immediate authorization." Celia's voice dropped lower, calm and cutting. "They think I'm just another black woman making someone uncomfortable." Ethan didn't reply with empathy. He replied with orders. "Stay silent. Don't push. Let them keep thinking that." Then, one last command, spoken like a death sentence. "I'm coming." Celia closed her eyes, just for a second, then hung up. The phone returned to its cradle with a soft, final click. Across the room, Tanner Weiss hadn't even noticed. He was too busy adjusting phrasing on his fake report. She leaned back in the chair slowly, the plastic creaking beneath her, her breathing steady, her hands still bound, but her mind no longer caged. Her reflection flickered in the dark monitor across from her shoulders square, face unflinching. This room had been designed to erase people quietly. But now the silence was a signal, and somewhere above this basement of polite violations and digital dust, a clock had started ticking. Because what came next wouldn't be recorded on their cameras. It would be written into history. The phone was back on its cradle. Celia was back in her chair. The cuffs were still cutting into her wrists, but her silence had shifted. It wasn't surrender. It was detonation waiting for the match. The machinery around her kept moving. Gina Flores had returned with coffee in hand, her eyes glazed from routine, her fingers back at the keyboard dragging another video file into the digital void. Tanner Weiss was still hunched over his desk, scribbling fabricated phrases into a report that would be reviewed by a judge who already knew what the verdict would be. They didn't know the storm had already been triggered, but outside the city was waking up to it. At exactly 6:03 a.m., before the kitchen staff at Langston Regent had even begun prepping breakfast, 14 black SUVs turned the corner onto Whitmore Avenue like a row of war horses. They didn't rush, they didn't announce, they didn't need to. The convoy moved in perfect formation, stopping with calculated precision along the hotel's front entrance. The doorman, half awake, still nursing a coffee, froze mid-sip as 25 federal agents stepped out in coordinated tactical gear. No raised voices, no drawn weapons, just quiet certainty that made the ground seem smaller beneath their boots. They swept the marble lobby like a curtain being pulled off a lie. One agent broke off toward the security desk, another toward the elevator. The front receptionist opened her mouth to speak, then wisely closed it again. Downstairs, the lights flickered as the backup servers detected unauthorized access. In the basement-level control room, Gina Flores had just begun deleting the final audit log when the screen froze mid-session. A blinking red override appeared. Federal signature in progress. She barely had time to turn her head before two agents stepped in, one removing her hands from the keyboard, the other cuffing her wrists behind her back with all the gentleness of law turned mechanical. "You're done," the agent said flatly. "Everything you tried to erase, we already pulled it upstream." Tanner Weiss heard the boots before he saw them. He stood instinctively, lifting his hands halfway like a man trying to look innocent but already bracing for steel. He didn't get the chance. One agent slammed a copy of his forged report onto the desk. Another seized the original hard drive sitting in the CPU beneath his terminal. "You are under arrest for obstruction of justice, falsifying federal records, and unlawful detention of a government official," the lead agent announced. Weiss opened his mouth to object, but the words didn't make it out before he was face down on the desk, his badge scraping against the wood as cuffs locked around his wrists. Meanwhile, on the 12th floor of the Langston Regent, Judge Leonard Easton sat in a private breakfast suite with the hotel's CEO, sipping from a crystal glass of orange juice, the sunlight glinting off his gold watch. He was mid-sentence, something about narrative control, when two agents opened the door without knocking. The CO tried to protest, but one look at the black jackets with Department of Justice seals shut him up faster than any gavel. "Judge Easton," the lead agent said, "you're wanted for conspiracy to suppress evidence and collusion in obstruction of federal oversight. You'll be answering those questions in D.C." Easton didn't argue. He didn't blink. He simply folded his napkin, set it beside his untouched croissant, and stood as if his body already knew resistance was beneath his station. Back underground, the elevator doors slid open with a low chime, and Celia looked up. She wasn't cuffed anymore. The agent who released her hadn't said a word. He didn't need to. He simply unlocked the metal, placed the key on the table, and nodded once. Celia rose slowly, shoulders square, chin steady. Her wrists bore red imprints, but her steps were measured. When she stepped out of the room, the hallway beyond wasn't empty. Agents lined either side, silent, straight-backed, not as guards but as witnesses. Every person who had looked away was now watching. Every face that had once dismissed her now stood still as she walked through the corridor, past the failed erasure, past the dying machine of polite injustice. She didn't gloat, she didn't smirk, she didn't speak, but the look in her eyes said what no volume of law books ever could. You thought the cuffs were the end, they were only the beginning. As she passed through the glass doors into the lobby, the receptionist gasped softly. The same woman who had watched her dragged away now watched her return untouched. The marble still gleamed, the music still played softly overhead, but the air had changed. The story had changed, the silence had cracked. And the reckoning was just beginning. The headlines came before breakfast, before the coffee was brewed in courthouses across the state. Before morning anchors could catch their breath, before Judge Leonard Easton had time to call his lawyer. By 5:14 a.m., the footage had already been seized, archived, and authorized for release. By 6 o'clock, 3 unsealed indictments were printed on Department of Justice letterhead, and by 7 o'clock a.m., the Langston Regent Hotel's name was on the front page, for all the wrong reasons. The hearing chamber in Washington was packed by 7:45 a.m., though it wasn't scheduled until 9. Marble walls, brass sconces, every seat filled with someone who used to look the other way. Senators, reporters, justice officials, even former critics who now clutched notepads with shaking fingers. It was standing room only, and still, the room felt too small for what was about to unfold. And then she entered. Celia Grant stepped into the chamber wearing a simple black blazer, her wrists bare, her posture unflinching. She didn't bring a statement. She didn't need one. Her presence was the evidence. The silence followed her in, not forced but reverent. People didn't breathe. They watched. She walked past the rows of polished desks, past cameras aimed like loaded weapons, and took her seat behind the microphone. She didn't look at the men in orange jumpsuits seated at the defense table. She didn't need to. They knew, and she knew they knew. That was enough. Tanner Weiss sat hunched, no badge, no title, hands trembling. Gina Flores kept her eyes glued to the table, her hair now pulled back in a tight knot like she was hoping invisibility came with humility. Judge Easton sat upright, still trying to look like power hadn't left him hours ago. But the collapse had already begun. Celia adjusted the mic with a slow, steady hand. "When I walked into the Langston Regent Hotel," she began, "it was not a threat. I was not yelling, I was not loitering, I was not anyone's story yet. I was simply a woman, a black woman, waiting for tea." Her voice was calm, but the weight behind it was surgical. Her eyes swept the room, not pleading, not performing, but measuring. Her tone didn't tremble, it cut. "But in their system, I didn't need to do anything wrong. My skin was the reason. My silence was the suspicion. My presence was the problem." Murmurs stirred, but were quickly silenced. She wasn't done. "I watched footage deleted in front of me. I heard a report filed before I'd even spoken. I listened to them refer to me as a discretionary threat. That's not protocol. That's profiling. And that's not the failure of one hotel. That's the footprint of a pattern." Her words were soft, but they burned. Gasps came not from what she said, but from how plainly she said it. No anger, no raised voice, just unshakable clarity. "They didn't know my name. And they didn't care, because to them a black woman in a wool coat with a cloth bag didn't belong in their lounge. She didn't look like their kind of guest. She didn't sound like a risk, but she didn't sound like someone who'd stay silent either. And that scared them." She turned slightly now, just enough to face the rows behind her. "They wanted to erase me quietly, in a room with no cameras, on a report with no facts." She paused, then delivered it. "But the thing about trying to delete a person is that sometimes they remember everything." Then the door opened. A young man entered, nervous but determined. He wore jeans, a worn denim jacket, and a press badge clipped to his chest. Luis Raymond. Journalism intern, part-time barista, full-time truth-teller. He approached the committee desk, handed over a USB, and stepped back. The silence sharpened. The moment shifted. The screen lit up. Footage flickered into place, grainy but unmistakable. Celia seated calmly in the lounge, guards approaching, her standing, then being grabbed. A moment of resistance, verbal, not physical. Then cuffs. Then removal. Then another angle. Luis's phone camera, hidden behind a ficus, audio crisp. "Let's take her to the White Room," a voice said off-screen. "Easton'll cover it." The room erupted. The senator dropped her pen. A reporter whispered, "My God." One of the agents watching from the side visibly swallowed. Even the presiding judge leaned back as if trying to distance himself from what he had just witnessed. And then, like a final blow, came the bonus clip. Luis himself, pulled into a storage room the night after, interrogated by Tanner and Gina. No warrant, no camera, just threats. But Luis had recorded that, too. The audio filled the chamber like testimony. The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was recognition. This wasn't new. It was exposing. Sentencing came swiftly. Tanner Weiss, 31 years in federal prison for obstruction, abuse of authority, and false imprisonment. Gina Flores, 17 years and permanent disqualification from any role involving data security or public service. Leonard Easton, 35 years for conspiracy, suppression of evidence, and civil rights violations. His estate and offshore accounts were seized to fund a new justice restitution program. And the Langston Regent Hotel? They're stripped of its name, license, and board. Reopened months later as the Ava Duvall Center for Civil Accountability, above the Justice Hub, named for the grandmother Celia had once watched be denied service in a segregated diner. Inside, interrogation rooms became classrooms. Hallways that once erased people's rights now taught them how to defend them. The hotel that once silenced the unseen now echoed with the words, "Know your worth, know your rights, use both." And still, Celia didn't seek the spotlight. She never had. Celia never gave a TED Talk, never signed a book deal. She turned down a Senate appointment. She simply packed a bag and returned to Savannah, to a modest building across from a school, a whiteboard, a worn floor, a circle of chairs, and something even greater than justice: continuity. Above the door, a sign read, "Community Law and Memory, Instructor Celia Grant." Each morning she walked in early, unlocked the front door, and picked up a dry erase marker. And before every lesson she wrote the same line: "When power gets quiet, who still speaks?" She never asked to be remembered. But she was, not in statues, but in the silence that no longer stood unchallenged.